Hello and welcome to another lecture for BSAD 525. We are going to start looking at industry analysis and external analysis today. Let me pull up our slides here. And there we go. All right. So in this course, we start, if you like, from the outside in, looking at the general environment, macro factors, what we call, let me just get my annotation tools here, what we call our pest factors, or pastel factors. These are supposed to be parentheses. Basically, this is politics, economic factors, social factors, technological factors, and then sometimes, depending on context, you might want to add environmental and legal factors. That's our broadest level of analysis. We then move on to specific industry analysis, and that's what we're going to be talking about these things today. There's going to be 2 lectures on the topic of external analysis. So in this textbook, they divide the macro environment into these factors: the national and international economy, technology, government and politics, social structure, demographic structure, and the natural environment. However, and we'll talk about things in that order, but all of these can be assumed under the much more familiar acronym that's used more commonly of just PEST or pastel. So here we have natural environment. Again, sorry about my crummy brackets. I'm not very good at drawing with a mouse. Social structure, that goes into social factors. Demography also goes into social factors. Technology is still our T. Politics is our P. And economic stuff goes into here. So we'll cover them in the order given in the text, but when you analyze them, I'm happy just for you guys to do this. It's a little bit more memorable to have that mnemonic or acronym of pastel. So let's get into these topics. These topics influence our smaller industry environment in different ways that we'll also talk about. We'll talk more about the industry analysis and Porter's 5 forces later on. But we're concerned about these first and the impact that they have on our industry environment and our firm environment. At the lowest or smallest level, we eventually talk about inside the firm which exists inside the industry, of course. I'm just going to put an F for firm. And when we start looking inside the firm, we talk about resources and capabilities. That comes next week. So that's internal analysis. This week, we are doing external analysis. And why do we bother doing this? Why do we analyze the industry, for example? Well, it turns out that different industries have very different average profitability rates. This is median excess. This graph shows median excess return on capital. What does that mean? It means profit, economic profits. Those economic profits we were talking about, profits in excess. I'm just going to put prof instead of profits, greater than our weighted average cost of capital. And different industries have very different average profitabilities or median profitabilities. Median means that half of all firms do better than this, half of all firms do worse. Tobacco industry, extremely profitable. Motor vehicles industry, not very profitable. In fact, on average, more than half the firms make a loss. Same thing with agriculture. Steel barely breaks even. And why does this happen? Well, that's one of the reasons we use industry attractiveness. What's going on? What's the structure of the macro forces and then the industry forces that determine the average profitability of an industry? And there's three key influences there. There's the value of the product to the customers. Is the industry creating something for which customers are willing to pay a great deal, like life-saving insulin, say? Or is it creating something that customers don't have a very high willingness to pay? I don't know, a particular color of background wallpaper for your desktop browser. So there's that basic level. Are we creating a willingness to pay for our customers? The next thing is, well, how intense is the competition? Given that we're creating some willingness to pay and creating some value for our customers, what is competition doing to the price we can charge, right? If we have our willingness to pay up here and our cost here, well, the intensity of the competition is going to impact which way this price moves. We'll put price and cost here, right? Given that we've created this willingness to pay, that's supposed to be a P. The competition determines how much of a price we can charge. If we're a monopoly, well, in theory, we can charge the full willingness to pay because we're the only game in town. And so we'll capture all that value. However, if there's a lot of, oops, let me undo that. If there's a lot of competition, then that's going to push this price closer down to our cost, and the customer is going to capture all this value. The final thing here is the relative bargaining power at different stages. That also affects the price, as does the intensity of the competition. That affects this number here. But the bargaining power we exercise versus our suppliers, put our price back here, is going to influence our cost. If we have a better bargaining position versus our suppliers, we can drive the price we pay or our costs down. If they have a better bargaining position versus us, they can push our costs up. And again, we can either expand or contract the firm's share of values. I'm just going to put an F here for firm. Here's a C for our customer. Here's an S for our supplier. These are our different shares of value. Of course, our supplier has their own costs down here somewhere, but we're not concerned with their costs right now, except insofar as it affects, that's kind of the floor of what they're going to charge us. We can't get them to charge us lower than cost under normal circumstances, lower than their cost. So these are the three key drivers that determine industry profitability. Different industries have different structures in terms of concentration. That's what's going on here. In a situation of perfect competition, all economic profit goes to break even, or that just covers the cost of capital. There's lots of firms. In theory, there's no barriers to entry or exit. If a firm wants to enter, it's relatively easy to do so. That's why there's lots of firms. We'll talk about exit barriers a little bit later. They're very interesting. Barriers to exit have to do with fixed costs that a firm has to pay whether or not they're selling. If an industry has very high fixed costs as opposed to marginal costs you only incur per unit. Fixed costs you have to pay no matter how many units you produce, even if you're producing zero. So that can drive profitability down quite fast. In perfect competition, everyone's producing the same thing, so they can't charge more because each product, the customers are indifferent between them. And customers have perfect information. We can't charge them more because they know the price of all the other products that are all homogeneous, and lots of firms are offering them. Think about internet retail. If I wanted to buy an iPad 10 right now, I could see quite quickly the price of all iPad 10s being sold online. Now, there might be people selling them privately that I don't have information about, and I could buy it cheaper, but nobody can really charge more. Someone selling their iPad privately can't really charge more than what all the customers can see online from Best Buy and Amazon, etc. And indeed, with things like iPads and, say, AirPads, most companies, if you check Amazon, if you check Best Buy, if you check Walmart, they're all going to have pretty much the same price because For that product, any firm who's selling it is selling the same product as a customer. You just want the cheapest one. So it drives profits down. It doesn't drive Apple's profits down, but it drives Best Buy's profits, Amazon's profits, and Walmart's profits down because there's only one price they can charge for the same thing, assuming it's going to same delivery times, they have it in stock, etc. Oligopoly now means few firms, kind of like the word oligarchy, which means rule by the few. In an oligopoly, we have a few firms. It's not none, but it's not perfect competition. It's not many either. Now we have, well, something's keeping perfect competition from happening. So we're assuming there's some entry barriers that are preventing other firms from entering the industry. Presumably there's some potential for product differentiation as well. Otherwise, we just get in the same sort of price war. Even if we have a few firms, but they're all selling the same product, it's homogenous. They'd have to charge the same price because pretty soon they'd need to compete on price because there's no differentiation. So here we have some potential to create willingness to pay for certain products. Apple can make a laptop that has certain features that customers will pay more for. A gaming laptop company can differentiate their product to gamers and charge a bit more. So there's some discretion and ability to charge more and push the price up towards that willingness to pay. And there may be imperfect availability of information. Not always, but maybe customers don't know our cost structure. They don't have a perfect view on all the prices in the market. With this imperfect availability of information, think about really here it comes down to, do we know our producers or our suppliers' cost structure? And can we see all the prices in the market pretty easily? If not, we're going to have imperfect information and the firms can exploit that to charge a higher price. If I don't know about a cheaper product that I could have bought, I will pay, somebody can charge me more for it. Next, we have a duopoly, where there's only two firms. Really similar. I mean, there's not much difference between a duopoly and an oligopoly, at least at the general level. Although when you get into economics, you get into situations where these two firms, there's only two players, so sometimes you can predict their strategy. If there's only two of you, it's more like a chess game. When we start adding more firms, it becomes harder to predict what other competitors will do in response to our moves. And then finally, we have a monopoly. One firm, something's keeping people out of that market, so there's high barriers. And of course, there's differentiation potential, almost by definition. We're the only firm offering the product, so we are differentiated by definition. And there may be imperfect availability of information. There might not be. Again, if you're the only firm, your customers know the price, but sometimes a monopoly can arise because of imperfect information. The cost to what we call search costs to find information and to monitor, those create things called transaction costs. I'll call them TCs that we're going to talk about later. These become important when we talk about the size of a firm and whether we want to vertically integrate or outsource something. Often the determining factor there is transaction costs, of which information costs are one type. So Michael Porter, thinking about these determinants that we were just looking at here, value of the product to customers, intensity of composition, and bargaining power, came up with Porter's 5 forces, probably the most famous conceptual tool in strategy. And we'll go through these one by one. We have the bargaining power of our suppliers. Can they push us down on price, or can we push up on them if they have weak bargaining power? There's the bargaining power of buyers. And same thing here. Basically, they're mirror images of each other. Sometimes you'll see buyers up here and suppliers down here, or vice versa. Just make sure you know which one you're talking about. When we're talking about our suppliers, we want the price to be low that we're paying. And when we're talking about buyers, we generally want the price to be high that our buyer is paying. And the things that determine the bargaining power are similar in each case. We just have to remember in which one we're the price payer. We then have this idea of barriers to entry. What's the threat of new entrants? Are there high barriers to entry that keep potential new entrants out and limit the number of firms? Or are there no barriers to entry, in which case there may be anybody who wants to can get in and compete and reduce the profitability to that competitive balance, or competitive equilibrium is the word you hear in economics. But we're not just competing against, actually, I'll go to this one first. Here we have sort of the center of our conceptual tool, the existing industry and the firms that are in that industry, and they're competing the profits down to the extent that they can't differentiate each other. Perhaps if it's highly differentiated, every firm can find its own little niche. Think about baseball teams, right? The baseball teams, each of them has their own fans in the major league, and there's enough fans to go around, and there's some segmentation by geography or whatever else. But it's not just the existing competitors. There's the potential competitors that could bring down the prices, but there's also substitute products. And we'll pause on this one. Substitute products aren't competitors' products. And I want you guys to really grasp this when you do your analysis. Maybe I'm going to write it down here. Not equal. This is our not equal sign to competitors. That's a C. Substitute products, think about, I don't know, the industry for coffee. What are potential substitutes? If the price of coffee were to go too high, well, customers might start drinking tea instead of coffee, or they might start drinking energy drinks. So that puts a downward pressure. The availability of substitutes for coffee, depending on how much you prefer coffee to tea or other drinks, that puts a downward price on the price of coffee. Similarly, if nuclear power is a substitute for liquid natural gas power with power generation, and that can put a severe downward price on the price of oil, for example. If it becomes too expensive, people start investing in nuclear power plants. Back in the day, propane used to be used more often, or LNG used to be used more often in vehicles because it was cheaper. Same thing with diesel. Now diesel's actually, I think, a bit more expensive, but that's a substitute for gasoline. So here we have a useful graph that I would recommend returning to when you do your industry analysis, and it has the determinants of each of these forces. We're going to go into these one by one here and look at each of these, what I call drivers or determinants of each force. One thing to remember is that each of these forces is a profit-destroying force. Each of Porter's 5 forces is a profit-destroying force. If the force goes up, profits go down on average for the industry. Likewise, if the force goes down, the average profitability goes up. They're inversely related. These are profit-destroying forces. Another really important thing here to remember, industry analysis and Porter's 5 forces is for analyzing the industry, not the firm. I'm going to write that in capitals, not the firm. Your 5 forces analysis is performed at the industry level. If you are analyzing Ford for your company, you don't perform a 5 forces analysis about Ford and Ford suppliers and Ford's buyers, etc. You would analyze maybe the automotive industry or a segment of that, maybe trucks and SUVs, not Ford itself. So please remember, 5 forces and industry analysis is conducted at the industry level, not the firm level. Let's start with threat of substitutes. The main thing there is the buyer's propensity to substitute and the price performance. Sorry, there's a typo in this slide. I should say price performance characteristics. If we're talking about coffee, well, how likely, on average, are buyers to be willing to substitute tea for coffee? And what's the price performance of that? If I was going to be totally utilitarian as a coffee drinker, maybe I'm thinking, well, what's the price per milligram of caffeine from tea versus coffee? And is that a good trade-off for me? If tea costs $1 million, well, that's not a very good price performance characteristic. Tea's not a very viable substitute for coffee if the price is too high. But if the price performance characteristics are similar to or better than our own, well, that might be a threatening substitute, assuming there's a willingness on the part of the buyer to substitute for that alternative product. Some products, you should know, have very limited availability of substitutes. If you were studying, say, I don't know, the defense industry, well, what's the substitute for the defense industry? There aren't really substitutes for missiles and tanks and fighter jets. Maybe drones, if you zoom in a level, maybe drones are an effective substitute for military airplanes, and one that's you're willing to consider. But as a whole, some industries have higher threat substitutes than others. I don't know, certain foods, maybe people would be more willing to substitute margarine, which is an oil, vegetable product, for butter. That might be a relatively high propensity to substitute that you should consider. But some industries may have really, and be aware of this, some industries may have almost no viable substitutes. Some of them will have lots that are viable that you need to consider. One group I remember once was looking at theme park industry. That has lots of substitutes because really you're thinking about, well, the buyer of a theme park vacation has lots of different industries they could look at for a vacation. Maybe they want to go skiing. Maybe they want to go on a cruise. Those would all be viable industries for the theme park industry. So just some examples. But remember, substitutes are not competitors' products. And really, you shouldn't even think that if you're analyzing it at the industry level, because you're already thinking about the industry's product, not your firm's product. Next one is threat of new entry. And here there are a lot of potential barriers to entry. That's the main thing we're concerned about when we talk about threat of new entry is what is keeping other firms from entering. The main ones that you tend to see are capital requirements is a big one. If you are in the semiconductor manufacturing industry, it's going to cost you billions and billions of dollars just to get in the game. Very few firms have access to the kind of scarce financial resources you would need. You're going just to talk about capital. Economies of scale can also be a barrier to entry. It's estimated that you need to be producing at least 4 million cars per year to have sufficient economy of scale in the automotive industry. I can't just start building cars out of my garage that cost the same as a Ford F-150 and scale up as an individual. I would have to enter the truck making industry at scale in order to be able to get the economies of scale to give customers a price that's competitive. Sometimes there's what we call an absolute cost advantage. For example, labor is much cheaper in Southeast Asia. An industry based there is going to have an absolute cost advantage. Certain types of oil are less dirty than other types of oil. In Canada, we have a very dirty type of oil that's expensive to refine called Western Canadian Select. Louisiana has a much purer type of oil called Louisiana Sweet. Louisiana has a cost advantage, absolute cost advantage in the oil and gas industry because they have access to a better resource. Same thing with Saudi Arabia. Saudi oil is very pure and costs less to get out of the ground and costs less to refine. Another thing here is product differentiation. If I have a great product, or even better yet, a great brand, I can't just all of a sudden start competing with Louis Vuitton handbags as a no-name bag company. Louis Vuitton has established that brand identity and that differentiation over years and years. I can't just walk into the industry, slap the name Johnston on it, and think I'm going to be able to charge as much as Louis Vuitton in the handbag industry. Again, we're analyzing the industry level here, so maybe the luxury handbags would be the industry if we were analyzing Louis Vuitton. I can't just walk into the luxury goods or luxury watches industry as a no-name. That would keep potential entrants out. I'd have to enter with some really good resources in terms of financing to do marketing and brand building and even create designer products. I'd need to have access to good designers, which all costs money. There might be legal and regulatory barriers. Another barrier in the oil and gas industry is the high cost of complying with environmental legislation. And in fact, increasing environmental legislation has driven out a lot of smaller producers and tended to favor the biggest companies who can afford to be compliant and have the legal resources and the technological resources and the staff resources to comply with environmental legislation. So legal, or think here also of, say, the American Medical Association. I can't just set up as Dr. Johnston's plastic surgery and, nip and tuck Wegovy weight loss clinic, because there are legal barriers. I need to be licensed by a regulatory body to do plastic surgery or practice medicine or prescribe drugs. That's a very effective barrier. Same thing, maybe if I wanted to set up a school, there would be some hurdles that I had to get over. Finally, there's retaliation. An industry that has large, successful incumbent firms might retaliate against you. How might they do that? Well, they might have a lower cost structure and be able to drive you out of business through a price war. Or maybe they might be able to compete in other ways with your products. They might be able to retaliate by spending a lot on advertising and you can't afford that. Or even start suing you for, say, frivolous lawsuits related to patent infringement, dubious patent infringement. Apple did this to Samsung a lot. Apple sued Samsung for its user interface, kind of that app look. The Apple sues everyone. That's a form of retaliation in a lot of cases to hurt their competition. So those are all threats of new entry. Bargaining power of buyers, which is, again, going to be identical or symmetric to the bargaining power of suppliers. Just in one case, we're the buyer from our suppliers. In another case, our buyers are buying from us. Well, what determines the bargaining power? There's a few different things. There's the relative bargaining power, and the concentration of the buyer's industry to the seller's industry is key here. One good example of this would be the PC industry. There's lots of different PC laptop manufacturers, Dell, Lenovo, HP, Compaq, you name it, lots of them. How many suppliers of high quality CPU chips are there? Well, there's really just Intel and AMD. So their supplier, if we're thinking of Intel and AMD or the CPU industry, is very concentrated. The PC industry is not concentrated. So the PC industry has to pay a lot more because the chip industry has a better bargaining position. The buyer's information can also affect bargaining power. If I know all the different products out there and I know their prices, I can bargain harder than if I don't know what else is out there and you're the only seller I've been able to find. And the ability to backwards integrate. If I'm a supplier selling to a buyer, if I try to raise my price too high and my buyer is able to backwards integrate, well, I might want to be careful about how high I push the price. Intel pushed the price too high on Apple on their chips, and Apple just decided to backwards integrate and start making Apple Silicon, making their own chips. Not all firms can do that. It requires a lot of resources to make chips, but Apple was able to backward integrate successfully. So these are what you might call structural factors related to concentration, the amount of competition in each industry, information availability, and the ability to integrate. Then there's this other category that's more related to the buyer's specific price sensitivity. First one here is interesting. How important is the item in relation to the buyer's total cost? Or what's the size of the cost of that item? Again, if I'm in the PC industry, The CPU is going to be a significant part of the cost of the laptop I'm selling. So I'm going to want to negotiate harder. Now, I may not be able to because I might be constrained to a monopoly. So I might be price sensitive, but it doesn't matter because of the structure. If I think about another thing, let's say housing prices, the price of a house. Buyers of houses are going to negotiate quite hard. When you go out to buy a house, you're going to probably come in with an offer lower than the listed price because your house is such a big part of your total expense structure as a buyer, your total costs year on year. You probably aren't going to negotiate very hard on a pack of post-it notes or a pack of pens at Walmart. Maybe Walmart charges $5 for a pack of pens. Well, it's not a lot of money for you. You're not going to go search the whole market and try to negotiate downwards because it's just not that big a cost item. There's a firm that my friend works for called Illinois Tool Works, and their whole strategy is based on making products that are small in proportion to their buyers' total costs. They make the little plastic parts of cars, maybe the ashtray, things like that, that the buyers don't negotiate very hard on because they're small items. And as a result, they can charge quite a large markup because the buyer doesn't really care too much if they charge them $1 or 90 cents. Next is the level of differentiation in the purchased item. Is this a commodity like gasoline? Well, if it's gasoline, we're not going to be very willing to pay more for your gasoline at Exxon versus BP's gasoline because it's not differentiated. We're fine with either. In the case of CPU chips, well, for a long time, customers wanted Intel CPUs because they were the fastest. And so Intel was the differentiated producer, or AMD, and other cheap chips wouldn't suffice for the PC buyers. So again, because that was a differentiated item, differentiated by performance, the buyers were willing to pay more. The PC makers, Lenovo, Dell, were willing to pay more for Intel because Dell and Lenovo were price sensitive because of the differentiation factor in that input. If you make Cummins turbo diesel engines, or if you make really key components for a car manufacturer, you might be able to be more differentiated. If you make Pirelli tires versus cheap tires, you can charge more to the auto companies buying those tires from you. Another one here, the intensity of competition amongst the buyers. This is simple supply and demand. When you think about the release of PlayStation 5, the supply was limited and there was a lot of competition amongst people who wanted to buy a PS5 that allowed Sony to charge quite a high price. As the number of potential buyers goes down, they're not competing anymore. As supply goes up, there's less competition amongst the buyers. That pushes the price down. And finally, whether the item is critical to the quality of the buyer's own output. Think maybe of a high quality musical instrument like a guitar. Maybe if you're selling a really nice Gibson guitar that you charge $5,000 for, you need the best quality rosewood for the neck of your guitar or the best mahogany for the body of your guitar. Well, Gibson's going to pay more to the suppliers of that wood because it's such a critical input than maybe for the little plastic dots on the neck of the guitar. So if the item is critical to the quality of your own input, or maybe think about really high grade aluminum if you're making aerospace rockets, the supplier of that high quality aerospace grade aluminum will be able to charge more to its buyers because it's critical to the buyer's own output. So these things, the buyer's price sensitivity and their willingness to pay more in the context of competing offers is one thing. And then that competition really is informed by, and I would say this, the intensity of the competition amongst the buyers is on one side, the intensity of competition amongst the suppliers is the other side of that, supply and demand. Next force is the rivalry between the established competitors. A big part of this, again, is just going to be the concentration. How many firms are there in our industry? If we're the only firm in the industry, competition is theoretically zero. And we can charge more, our profits will be higher because there's no competition to compete away our prices. What's the diversity of the competitors? Do we have different strategies? Are we selling, do we have different cost structures? Are we selling slightly different products? Maybe I'm Porsche and you're Ford, and really our products don't compete with each other directly in most of our products. The guy who's buying a Porsche 911 isn't the same guy who's buying a Ford Mondeo or a Ford Edge. So that diversity of competitors allows us each to have our own space and not compete directly. That's related to product differentiation as well. If we can create feature sets or brands that are unique and attract different parts of the market, we can all sort of segment the market differently and charge more to our own separate segmented customers for features or brand value that our competitors don't offer. This here, excess capacity and exit barriers, is a really interesting factor I mentioned already. It impacts who comes into the industry, but once they're there, it can impact the profitability. A great example here of exit barriers is the airline industry. The airline industry has a lot of fixed costs. They're paying the leases or the financing of their airplanes. It's very capital intensive. They're paying leases on runways and different routes. They have staff that they have to pay no matter what, a certain amount of staff. They have, let's say, pension obligations they have to pay. Those are all fixed costs. They will continue flying even if they're not covering their fixed costs. They'll continue operating as long as they cover their marginal costs, the costs of fuel, the costs of paying a pilot and a flight crew to do that flight. And even though they're making a loss, they'd be making more of a loss if they didn't continue operating and generating some marginal revenues. So basically, if you're analyzing exit barriers, that's really related to the ratio of fixed costs to marginal costs. If our industry is 100% marginal costs, well, as demand goes down, we can just keep tapering down our output, and we never need to make a loss. At a certain point, if demand goes to zero, we just stop and we don't have any losses. But as soon as we have fixed costs, commitments to pay, despite how many we sell, well, that creates exit barriers. And this can get really ugly in an economic downturn. Same thing with oil production. If you have that oil field and all that capital invested, you have to pay those fixed costs to run those big assets. You'll keep selling oil even below your fixed costs, and you'll make a loss. So that's right here. And this gets into the idea of excess capacity. Excess capacity is fixed cost capacity, say in plants and machinery, that cause you to continue operations just to cover those costs. And firms with excess capacity will lower their prices to bring online more demand, which, when they lower their prices, impacts the profitability of the industry. Scale economies relates to this as well. If we need to be producing at a certain level in order to be profitable, well, we've probably invested a lot. Scale economies come from fixed asset investment by definition, right? If we have 100% marginal costs, there are no economies of scale because our cost is the same for each additional unit. But if we have fixed costs, well, at a certain point, beyond a certain level of output, let's say we break even here on our fixed costs, and now our marginal costs as demand or units produced increases, our cost per unit is actually decreasing once we pass our fixed cost break even. This should all be familiar from your managerial accounting, but if it's not, just know that having fixed costs creates economies of scale, but if we're operating below our optimal scale or our break-even scale, we start to go into the red quite quickly, and there's really no way to get out. It's like being in debt. You have to keep paying off, and you keep working to pay off that debt, even though you're not accumulating wealth, you still have to pay these things. Still have to pay your health insurance, still have to pay your credit card bill, and try and dig your way out of the hole, keep the hole from getting any bigger. So, what kind of questions can we answer, and what sort of questions do we want to ask as an output of our five forces analysis, and really as we're conducting this analysis? Uh, well, a few things. Uh, One of the things is it helps us understand the current level of profitability. If we've looked at our industry and like the automobile industry, it's quite unprofitable. A five forces analysis helps us understand why that is. But it's not just a static analysis. We also want to be looking forward when we do an analysis like this. We might decide, well, it's the industry we're in is currently quite profitable. Maybe we're making in chips, GPUs that are booming because of AI. But maybe we want to say, well, is anything going to change over the next few years? It's very profitable now, but how do things look like into the future? Uh, could new entrants come online? Could the structure change that way? Uh, is there likely to be consolidation? Maybe we're in a really new industry where there's lots of competitors, but maybe we realize we're just at the beginning of what's called the industry life cycle, and that a lot of these new players are probably going to go bust or get bought out by larger players. Are people investing too much in capacity? Is there a lot of capacity coming online that's going to outpace the growth in demand? Think of fads here. I remember there was a big fad in Canada for lock room, these escape rooms, right? Somebody would buy some warehouse space or something and set up a lock room, and you go and try to solve riddles to get out of it. But everybody had the same idea. And so what happened was the prices went down and the profitability went down as more capacity came online. This is a really important one. Will innovation create new substitutes? How durable is the technology on which our product or our industry is built? If we are in the CPU industry, which has been relying on a similar architecture for years, how many transistors can we put on the chip? Well, at some point, physicists and computer scientists are working on something called quantum computing, and at a certain point, that's going to replace it. Or if you think about hard drive disks, those were the physical disks that were quite slow that we used for memory in our computers. You'd want to be thinking, well, at what point is random access or solid state disks going to replace our product? So you need to look forward and see what's currently going on, what's on the horizon that might substitute for our product. Will solar power or nuclear power replace LNG if we're in the oil and gas industry? So we do the static analysis, but we also try to predict looking forward which way the structure of the industry is headed. Big changes right now are happening, for example, in the video game industry. Microsoft, for example, is buying up lots of game studios because they've foreseen a few years ago now that it's really going to be moving more towards a subscription-based industry because of technological improvements in internet speed and download speeds. A lot of customers don't feel the need to have a physical disc that they paid $100 for, and they'd rather just pay $10, $20 a month to access a library of games. Something that we've already seen happen in the video streaming industry and the music industry. So these are all considerations of industry structure that we need to account for, not just now, but the future as well. Here's an example of a five forces analysis in the auto manufacture industry and how things have changed. I'm not going to go through all these here, but it's a good view on how different forces are either increasing or decreasing. And your macro factors, your pest factors are going to influence this. The political factors like tariffs might reduce international competition and reduce industry rivalry but also maybe increase the bargaining power of suppliers. Apparently, there was an aluminum fire at a factory in the US just last week that really increased Ford's price of aluminum. That's going to increase their supplier power combined with tariffs because now they can't access foreign aluminum as cheaply. So these things are always changing for most industries. Few industries are truly static. Technology is always changing things. We can also use a five forces analysis to come up with ways to improve, well, to develop strategy, and that comes from two dimensions. Can we improve the structure of the industry to make it more profitable? And or can we position ourselves within the industry in a more profitable position? Is there anything depressing profitability that we can change? Are we being held up by one particular supplier? And maybe we can invest or back in more suppliers or create supplier partnerships or backwards integrate. Is there too much competition from abroad? Maybe we can lobby the president for tariffs to keep out foreign vehicles. Not great for the customer, but as a domestic firm, tariffs, you can get tariffs and lobby for tariffs that protect you. The agriculture industry has been doing this for decades, well, really for centuries, lobbying for tariffs on imported food to prop up the prices of domestic food. That's a strategy to improve the profitability of an otherwise unattractive industry. Otherwise, maybe we can, within an industry, we can position ourselves better to be more profitable. Apple's done this very well in the PC industry. They've tied their hardware to their software. They don't buy their software from Microsoft for their laptops. They make their own software. They've integrated that way. They don't buy chips anymore from Intel. They backwards integrated that way as well. They created a differentiated brand using very nice industrial design so that customers would pay more for their product than they would for their competitors in what is otherwise an undifferentiated, unprofitable laptop and PC industry. A key consideration here before you even start your industry analysis is to think about, well, have we defined our industry correctly? If you define your industry poorly, it's like a computer program, garbage in, garbage out. So we need to define it properly at first, or we're going to get the wrong answer. Is Ferrari in the same industry as Ford? Well, it's a motor vehicle company. They sell cars, but Ferrari is a very differentiated product. They are probably not competing, as I've said before, with Ford for customer dollars. So maybe we'd have to refine it a bit. Maybe it's the luxury or performance auto industry if we're talking about Ferrari, and really we need to be comparing it to companies like Lamborghini and maybe Rolls-Royce or Bentley. Those are our real competitors if we're in Ferrari. We're actually a different subsegment with very different industry fundamentals. Ferrari is very profitable. Ford is not in terms of profit margin, as we saw in our financial analysis lectures. The key criterion here is substitutability. What products and what competitors do customers substitute our product for? If we're Harley Davidson motorcycles, maybe one of our key competitors, maybe we should be thinking about other toys for boys or things that lawyers buy when they're having a midlife crisis. Do customers prefer American-made trucks in America? Are they less willing to buy Hyundai trucks? Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. So that's substitutability on the demand side. Substitutability on the supply side refers to, well, how easily can we switch to making something different? If we are making, I don't know, airplanes, or let's say that we're in the defense industry, are there other potential competitors who could quite easily switch from making airplanes to making missiles? That's substitutability on the demand side. Maybe we need to group aerospace and defense into one industry, or maybe we don't. Maybe we treat them as separate. But the key here is going to be who are our competitors and who are our, on the supply side, potential competitors. These decisions all inform how we define our industry. Be very careful when you're defining your firm's industry. If you need help, just ask. or run it by me if you think you're in the right industry or not. Just so you know, and as you saw here, S&P Capital or your SIC codes are probably not the best guide. The best guide is to think, who are your 3 or 4 key competitors, and how would you define the industry that you're all in together? If you have a company with lots of segments, you might have to choose one of the reporting segments. If you were analyzing Apple, well, the smartphone industry is different from the music streaming industry. You wouldn't just define Apple, I don't know, as a tech firm and try to analyze it that way. There are too many different sub-industries with different dynamics. Music streaming, smartphones, laptops, financial services even, right, with Apple Pay. You need to define your industry carefully. And you guys, many of you need to choose a sub-segment of your industry. One of the key outputs of our industry analysis, what we move on to next, is identifying key success factors, or KSFs. Again, this is done at the industry level. You're asking, what do we need to compete successfully in the industry as we've analyzed it? And again, that has 2 components, what you might call a supply side and a demand side. On the demand side, we have to think, well, who is our customer segment? Who are they? Do we serve the whole market broadly, or do we serve a subsection with specific needs? And what are those needs? What do customers want from our product? Who are the customers we're targeting? And what increases or decreases their willingness to pay? On the supply side, we have to think about, who are our competitors? What is competition based on? Is it based on price? Do we just need to reduce our costs and get our costs as low as possible? Do we need to, maybe, is it based on technological advance, like the chip industry? Are we always racing to double the speed of our current CPUs? How intense is the competition? That's part of our 5 forces analysis. Is there anything we can do to better our competitive position? Can we backwards integrate into certain parts of the value chain? Can we find a certain region that's underserved or has less competition? Maybe we want to be like Rouse's and only serve the Gulf Coast. How do we address our competition? And from that will come some list of key success factors for our industry. Again, we're not talking about our firm. We're saying, what are the things that a company in this industry, any company, needs to do to succeed? And so here's an example for this, for a few different industries: steel, fashion, and clothing. I won't read all these examples, but here we have different customer wants for each industry. Customers who are looking at fashion will have different wants than a business-to-business steel buying company. Or customers buying from a supermarket have different desires than they do for their clothing. What do firms need to do to survive? What's the basis of competition? Is it strong price competition? Is there cyclical demand? Do we need to keep a clean balance sheet without much debt to survive economic downturns or downturns in the price of a commodity? That's very important in oil and gas. You can't have much debt in a highly cyclical industry because that debt will hurt you on a downswing. Do we need to produce high levels of differentiation to charge a higher price? Do we need to worry about low barriers to entry? All different considerations from the competition side. And then that will create some list. These are what the lists might look for. I would say come up with 3 to 5 key success factors for your industry. And these key success factors are going to be what links our view on resources and capabilities, the internal parts of the firm, with our external analysis. We identify key success factors, and then when we look inside the firm, internally, we say, well, how are we doing in these key success factors? Does any of our resources or capabilities, do we have strengths in these key success factors from our internal resources and capabilities? Do we have weaknesses? That's how we connect our external analysis to the internal analysis we perform later. Here's another example, an analysis of the airline industry and seeing how these key success factors play out with very specific industry benchmarks. These are all benchmarks that every airline in the airline industry, every company will be evaluating themselves on. The profitability is equal to the yield. And to maximize the yield, we have to do certain things to maximize. These are the formulas for yield, load factor, and unit costs. And each of these different benchmarks or key success factors, benchmarks, is driven by these key success factors. These are the key success factors that play into each aspect of performance within the airline industry. And you would, depending on your industry, you'd need to figure out what are some key success factors and what are the benchmarks by which we measure those key success factors, and what areas do we need to consider for each of those drivers. And this is how you might map out your own industry for your firm. Not your firm at this stage, but how you'd map out the industry. Here's a similar exercise, but using it sort of different view, looking at the retail industry. How do we increase return on sales? And how do we increase the total asset turnover? But in this case, they're using capital employed. If you were doing return on assets, which I prefer, you'd use sales over assets, but they'd both be maximized in the same way. We maximize our total asset turnover via these key success factors. We maximize our profitability or our return on sales by these key success factors. The mix of products, avoiding markdowns by having tight inventory control so that we don't have too much of last season's inventory that we have to sell at a discount. Is there any way to sell at scale and minimize our COGS by buying procuring lots of materials at the same time? These are different activities that would maximize our total asset turnover. Some of them are related, some of them aren't. All right. I won't go through the summary here because I've been going on long enough already. But this is going to be a key slide pack for you guys to review as you perform your 5 forces and your pest analysis. We'll look further at industry analysis in our next lecture, and I look forward to seeing you there.